No. Tonight we're going to be going through Greco-Roman religious life. So last week we covered the gods and kind of their worldview of what exists and such. We're going to kind of talk through the religious practices tonight, and then we have one more week that has to do with some of the religious nature of the Greco-Roman period. What we're going to cover next week is kind of the superstitious and little individual things like magic, how they viewed magic, and then the mystery religions and how that impacted Christianity, some of those were later developments. And so we'll cover that stuff next week. But this week we're doing basic Greco-Roman religious life. So we already talked in the other week that their practice of the worship of their gods was not exclusive. In other words, they easily transferred their loyalty when one god said, oh, well, this Zeus, well, that's the same as Jupiter, that's the same as this. They're able to bring in other gods and add to their pantheon. And so that allowed for this bridging of the gap as the empire expanded and they had different people from different cultures with different gods. They still were able to find a unity because they just kind of added all of those together. And this is why when Christianity gets to the Greco-Roman Empire, it's very controversial because Christianity and Judaism says there is no other God. We can't worship any other God. We cannot sacrifice to any other God. We cannot honor any other God at all. And that was scandalous. It blew the minds of the Greco-Romans, like, what in the world? And that's why they were referred to as atheists, because they didn't believe in the gods. And they believed instead in the one God over all. The identification of the deities, as we said, easily transferred, but this ended up with a kind of a love for all foreign things. So as the empire grew and during the time of Alexander the Great, over those centuries, it kind of became the thing to have the foreign god or the newer thing that's there. And actually, during the first century, Judaism, as I said before, was very trendy amongst the women, especially in the east, like Syria and Turkey area. A lot of women gravitated to Judaism, and there was an exoticness to it. It also fostered a culture of synchronism, where you just borrowed the practice of the different cultic ideas and used them to worship your god. This becomes kind of an issue within the church, especially because we end up, as we're going to see, borrowing a lot of stuff from Greco-Roman religion, and it shapes Christianity a good amount. And that leaves us today where, okay, this stuff was borrowed from Greco-Roman culture, but we're 2,000 years later. Does it still matter? Should we get rid of it or keep it or things like that? You also had, at this time, amongst the general population, a sense of just kind of worshiping power or the powers that are there. Biggest thing about these powers is that they're not personal. So in other words, there were the individual gods like Zeus and so on and so forth, but they also would worship kind of magical powers. And actually magic, and as we're going to see next week, magic was a big thing back in this day. When they have, don't remember if it's Ephesus or one of the other towns in Paul's missionary journeys, where when the gospel reaches there, they bring all of their books on magic and burn it. And the books on magic were worth a huge amount of money. So it tells you how popular magic and stuff like that was, because there was kind of this idea of just this magical power that's out there that you could satisfy through certain little rituals and so on and so forth. We encounter then in Acts, we have Simon the magician in Acts 8, 9 through 10, and we get Artemis the magician. And so these are not guys with a top hat pulling a bunny out and doing card tricks. This is a very different type of magician. They would have functioned similar to, I think the Artemis the magician, he actually was like an advisor to a king on the island of Cyprus. And so think more like Rasputin in Russia before the Tsar fell. He was this kind of weird mystic man that would help guide a ruler through the powers of being able to predict the future through magic and things like that. manifestations of power were worthy of worship. So there were things that would happen that were the result of, like salvation. We have liberty, luck. One that's not included here would be peace, like Pax Romana. But these things were then worshipped as just powers, worshipped in the sense of incense would be burnt to them and there would be a desire for them to work on your behalf. But this worship of impersonal powers is going to be part of why there's an easier move into putting the emperors up at deity status, as we're going to get to at the end of this lesson. During this time, especially about 100 years or so before Christ, you have Plato, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. They were around the 400s and such BC, and they had a huge impact. But it actually took a number of years for their teaching to get widespread. And out of those three, especially their teachings, especially Aristotle, there came to be this sense of really just one perfect deity, but not necessarily personal deity. Aristotle argues, for instance, that for something to be truly divine, it would have to be perfect, and for it to be perfect, it could never change, and so therefore there's this, changeless something that is there, and he likened that to the fate and so on and so forth. These philosophies, they pointed to this kind of divinity that made it less human, because the Greeks were all of their gods were very human-like. And then as this happened, the lesser gods start to get even lesser, because even Zeus and them are kind of seen somewhat as lesser than this monotheistic deity. And so those intermediary powers become more and more identified as demons, and so you have that reference to demons a lot more frequently. Remember last week we talked about how demons aren't negative at this point in the culture. They're positive spirits or negative spirits or neutral spirits, and so on and so forth. This move of seeing everything kind of under one big overarching divinity clearly prepped the way for Christianity, though, coming in and saying, here's that one deity, here's who he is, and then moving forward with that. So some interpret when it says, that Christ came in the fullness of time, that this was part of that prepping of the entire culture to move away from the many deities toward one. That's even so much that some early church fathers, I feel erroneously, attributed true salvation and the status of being God's children to Aristotle and Socrates and such, because they had come so close to the truth of things. However, if you actually, if you read through their stuff, they're very clearly still believing in the gods. There's still some very big differences between what they have concerning that one deity versus the way God revealed himself to be. So you also have then, with this kind of moving towards that one big overarching power, the bigger worship of fate. And we talked last week about how fate ends up being kind of identified with Yahweh, and that actually was something the Jews were already starting to do for Yahweh before Christianity even started to go out. As they were like, yes, there's that overarching fate, that's Yahweh, by the way, and he's the one that's acting that. And so the Romans saw their dominance as a result of fate, that it was just the fate and the will of the gods, or the will of this thing, to that they were going to rule that, and think like what we have as Americans, a manifest destiny. It's like this was just what God willed, and that's why we ended up having control all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Fate was strongly linked to the stars, and so astrology also became popular. One of the things about Artemis, one of the goddesses we're going to be talking about a little bit later, is she was supposed to have some influence to be able to change fate, and that's seen on her images by the fact that she has a necklace that has the different signs of the zodiac on it, because she then could somehow impact that, and that's one reason she was popular as well. But stars and astrology was very popular at this time. The concept that the heavenly bodies influence us, and if you can read them right, you can kind of predict some of that. And the popular deities of the latter empire started to have power over fate because that was a definite weakness, and it kind of started to correct over time. During this time period, the religion was not a private matter. It wasn't like something you just had yourself and you didn't talk to anybody else about it. And there definitely was in no way a separation of church and state. That didn't exist at all. And instead, whatever faith you did and whatever religious act you did, it was always at the least with your family, with other people, with the village, with all of those things. There's always more of that expression corporately. Now, the fact that you could kind of choose which God you wanted to worship exercised a little bit of sense of individuality, because I'm going to really honor this God, or I'm going to really lift up this one and be devoted to them. And so there's that freedom of choosing that, and that put together with being able to blend other gods, put together with the trend towards exotic religions and such, prepared a way for a more openness to Christianity. You see, sometimes you wonder, how did Paul and them walk into these Greek cities, declare, hey, by the way, this is open to you Gentiles, and they're like, oh, cool, and they just joined it. Like, how would that be? And there's a lot of ways that they were ready for that. The religion of the Greeks, however, as we talked a little bit before, it was not closely related to morality. So there wasn't a way of the Greek religion coming in and saying, now here's the morals you have to live by. And very seldom do you see those two connected, whereas Christianity came in and had a very strong set of morals that you're now living by. For Greek religion, and it was more ceremonial cleanness in order to do the sacrifices correctly. And most of the codes of conduct had to do more with something that developed within society. It wasn't the gods saying you can't do this. It was something that was unacceptable to the community. So here, this is, by the way, this is a quote from this book. I'm going to read a few others tonight if I can remember. A good deal of the content of what I'm teaching is from this book. I'd say 90%. Borderline plagiarism, just giving you a heads up. So if you ever want to buy the book and review the material and stuff like that, a lot of it is in here. Not so much the history part we did. I expanded the history portion that he has a lot for the first semester, but this section of the class is a lot from this book. And he says the wedding of ethics and religious beliefs based on divine revelation was one of the important strengths of Judaism and Christianity in the ancient world. It was something that actually kind of pulled upon them, because what had happened in the Greek world is the philosophers had been pushing for these ethics. The philosophers were kind of calling them to a system of morals to some sense. But their gods were like completely amoral, and it didn't matter. There was no connection at all between the religion and this thing that philosophers were pulling them to. Christianity kind of came and melded those two together in a way that was attractive to many of the Greeks. Now, one of the major aspects of Greek religion and Roman religion is that they had their civic deities that they would worship, Zeus and such. But there's also a very strong sense of domestic and rural religion that we might say was more superstitious and dealt with smaller gods. You have here this quote, one could hardly have taken a step out of doors without meeting a little shrine, a sacred enclosure, an image, a sacred stone, or a sacred tree. So that would have been almost anywhere you went in the Roman Empire, not just Greece or Italy. You have in Greek then, the average family home, you had a Zeus of the enclosure. Now here Zeus is kind of like being just used as the word God. It's not saying, this is the Zeus. We have Zeus of the enclosure. And when you say enclosure, that could mean like a walled city. It could mean your fenced in community. It could mean your house. It's just this is the god that watches over the area that is enclosed in your property or such. As you would go into the gate of either that town, village, city, or into the door of the house, right there would be an altar to the Zeus of the enclosure that you would offer incense on, and have small offerings that you put there. Athens as a city had an altar to Zeus Herkios right as you walked in the gate. You also have quite frequently represented in the houses pictures of what they call the good demon, the Agathos daimon. It's inscribed, as it says here, on household altars, and it was seen as the spirit that would watch over your household and keep it safe. Also, as you're going to see in some of the pictures that we have, there was a constant representation of a snake that was seen as helping to protect, and it was kind of the Zeus of the enclosure as well, or the Agathos daimon. Either name would be applied to the snake at different times. And the dirt floors with the snakes, the rodents, as it says here in the notes, was part of why they had that snake as a representation. I still think it's rather fitting that Zeus is represented as a serpent, given our beliefs. And then small offerings were often left out for the Agathos daimon, which the snakes gladly ate. And at times, this Zeus of the enclosure or the Agathos daimon would be replaced by Zeus Kresios, which is the Zeus of the pantry, which again is watching over all the food and stuff that's in there, protecting it from rodents and so on and so forth. As you went into the Greek house, you had the hearth, which is basically where they had the fires to keep things warm, but they cooked everything over the hearth, and it was really the center of the domestic life in the home. Every time that you made a meal, it would start with an offering to the household god, and then it would afterwards there would be another offering to the household god. Usually the offering at the beginning was part of the food. Offering at the end would be pouring out of a wine, and it would be poured out to Agathos daemon or the Zeus of the enclosure, whichever one that house was honoring. The family is inundated with domestic piety. So the piety here is not, don't think Christian piety. Think they made sure they did all their rituals right. They were, from a very young age, they were told, here's this, say this prayer, say this thing, put this here, do this. Everyone knew what the whole setup was and how they were supposed to go through it. And I was trained from childhood on up. The father functioned as the priest in the family. And so when they were doing the more major sacrifices and stuff, he would always be the one who performed those. And especially at the sacred meals, which would happen probably about once a month, that they would have something like that. He also oversaw the major ceremonies within the culture: birth, the crossing over into puberty, marriage, funerals. They were accompanied by ceremonial acts done by the father, and the father is the one who kind of legally had that authority and made it legal. So like say a wedding, or when we get to marriages, you're going to see that in essence, there wasn't a sense of going and having a civil magistrate marriage or having some religious figure like a pastor or somebody marry you. It was the father himself who would do that. So if your parents didn't approve of that, then it was not a legitimate comes from legal, was not a legitimate marriage. So if you just went off and lived with somebody, then according to, you're going to also see from the culture, according to Roman law, after a year, you're just married once you've been living together for a year. However, that's an illegitimate marriage. Any children born to that marriage cannot inherit anything. And that becomes a major part of the pride from legitimate wives to illegitimate concubines or illegitimate lovers that men commonly had, because as we said, there weren't any morals back then. And by the way, this is the primary thing that made something a concubine versus a wife. So if somebody was living if you're living together, that just means concupiscence, which is to sleep together. That's what concubine means. And so that's what a concubine means. You're unrecognized, your marriage is unrecognized, your relationship is unrecognized by the father, and so therefore it cannot inherit anything, so it's just a concubine. This is a picture of one possible example of a more average like Greek home. The hearth would be kind of at the center. You would have different rooms around it. As we're going to see later on, upstairs you would have a room that was just for women that men could not go into at all. And houses were typically structured this way. Now these can get much more elaborate, much more ornate and beautiful than what you see here, but this would be more of a common person's home. So outside of the home, there was believed to be supernatural powers of the countryside. So whenever you went out in the forest, there were spirits that were out there. As you went along the road, there were spirits that guarded the road. There were, spirits in trees and stones, and some of this may sound so, weird to us. But there's even just recently, if you go to some places like in Japan, I think it was Japan or China, but they had a rock that was supposed to have an evil spirit locked up in it, and then one day it just suddenly cracked in half and broke in half, and they're like, oh no, the evil spirit was released, and now everybody in the neighborhood's panicking. But that's kind of there's a sense of spirits can be in a rock, and maybe because somebody touched the rock and then they got sick, maybe somebody did something else and that happened, and so these spirits were all there, and they even personified the breezes. We call things like nor'easters, but they would have kind of personified that instead. And the spirits out in the woods, there were female spirits that were always shown in human form that were nymphs, and these were usually guided by one of the goddesses whose name I can't remember at the moment. They would inhabit the trees, the mountain caves, the sea, the springs, the rivers. They would be responsible for certain noises or certain happenings and such. And so you knew that those spirits were out there when you're a kid going out in the woods, and they probably used a few scary stories to get you out of there. You also had the wild countryside, which was more inhabited by male demons. So when you get out into the more wild nature, now you're thinking that there's these demons that typically are pictured half human, half animal. So centaurs, you have a man with a horse body. Fawns, you have a man with goat horns and goat legs. And satyrs, which are similar to the fawns. And so these are not always seen directly as evil, but they're often portrayed as very mischievous and very untrustworthy. They can mess with you and toy with you. And so the most popular of all of these was Pan, who is the son of Hermes, one of the Greek gods. The Roman name would be Faunus, and that's where we get the idea of the faun. And if you've watched C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, Mr. Tumnus would be a faun, and so Pan is portrayed just like that. Pan means all. I mean, it's what the Greek word Pan means. But he ends up being worshipped in various different places. He was seen as the god of the shepherds and the flocks, the mountain wilds, so hunting, rustic, all those things. When you read in the Old Testament and they talk about offering to the goat demons at Mount Sinai, that's kind of like what Pan. He was seen as the person who took care of your herds, watched over them, helped them to be fertile, but there could also still be some of that mischievousness to him. But he was definitely there for the hunters and those that were more in the agricultural scene. Pan was actually worshipped at Caesarea Philippi. If you guys have ever been to Israel, that's one of the sites that people go to. There's like a cave that goes in the mountain that's supposed to be an opening into Hades, and then Pan was worshipped at the temple that was there. So, cultic action. So what do we mean by worship? What did they do to worship them? Biggest one we talked a little bit about last week. They would heap up stones along the roadway to honor the spirits. And you still see that today as you go around. You see the stacked stones everywhere. And then sometimes you'd offer food or leave those there. There would be certain spots that were designated to do this, and you go through the countryside and you see them all over. And kind of the idea was if you went by and you saw the stack of stones, you were supposed to add another stone to honor that spirit that was there, and then he would protect you as you went on. And if you didn't, then you dishonored them, and you had to be worried about your trip. Some of the other ones, especially the like centaurs and a lot of the fauns and such, satyrs, they didn't really receive any sort of worship. They just got blamed for a lot of stuff. And so there wasn't really any cultic practice. Artemis, she's the one that's leader of the nymphs. Boy, my brain's not working. She's the one I was trying to think of. And Hermes. So Artemis and Hermes became important deities mainly because they were the ones over the spirits that had more direct contact and influence over the average person's life. Because as they're traveling and as they're farming and stuff like that, these are the deities they were most worried about, so they became more popular amongst the Greeks. So Roman domestic religion was just a little bit different, especially in how it started off. Like the Greeks, there was no division between their religion and domestic life and civic life. It was all mixed in together. The family household was definitely the major unit, not the individual. And the father of the family was the priest on behalf of the family, same as what you see in Greek. This father of the family, who's kind of the priest, though, is not just the dad of that nuclear family. You're talking like the godfather of the whole family. And that could be passed on by one's will. And then you had to have that permission, them for marriages and blessing and such like that. When he would do those things, when the paterfamilias would affirm something, they became legally bounding. And basically the same thing with the Greek. You had to have that in order for your marriage to actually be legitimate. For Roman, within the household, you had Vesta, who is the goddess of the hearth, Janus, the god of the doorway, Nates, who was the guardian of the pantry. So those are similar to kind of what we were seeing with Zeus of the cabinet. But one of the significant differences here is they have what they call lares, which were watchful and protective spirits over the family household. And so they are honored within the lararium. And as you would walk into a Roman house, you would see the lararium on the side. You're going to see pictures of it in just a second. And very similar to the Greek, the Zeus being portrayed as a serpent, so are these spirits and different spirits within this portrayed as a snake. So you have the three objects of worship in these larariums were usually the lares. It's going to be two jovial-looking fellows on either side of a single male who is representing the family genius, which we talked a little bit about last week, and then the snake also represents the spirit of the family. So the family genius is like the strength of power that a family name has, kind of thing. It's like it's not necessarily an actual person. But a family is powerful because its genius is powerful. And as the family grows in power, so would the strength of its genius grow in power. But it's kind of like just the spirit that unifies it all. And the lares were these jovial spirits who did what they could to protect the genius and protect the family. And then the snake also represented much of that same thing. In this, they're coming up. Caesar Augustus took this practice amongst the Latins and actually increased it, and you had now the lares being worshipped much like the demons within the Greek religion, where they're worshipped at the crossroads and they're guardians for the travelers, and he increases that influence, which brings a lot of the because with the civic religions offering to Zeus and offering to the more important gods, you had to be a citizen, you had to be a male, and you typically had to be decently wealthy. Whereas opening the cult of Lares Capitalis, this allowed for slaves, freedmen, people of the equestrian class and stuff like that to participate. We'll see more of that later. And so by doing that, as the empire increased, more people were getting involved in that actual culture of that religious observance of the Lares Capitalis. This is going to have a major impact on how easily the worship of the emperor spreads, because the worship of the emperor gets paired with this, and in fact there's places where it becomes Lares Augustalis for Caesar Augustus as opposed to the other. What he did in structuring this is he had to have it in essence approved officially as a form of religion for Romans. And then he divided cities and different areas into districts, and they erected shrines at major crossroads and at primary cities in the provinces. And this was a place then where the spirit of that place, or the genius of that place, was then worshipped. And so that was first done in Rome. When it extended to the provinces, that's when you have the Lares Augustales, and then you have the spirits of the roads were seen, as places where you would also worship or leave offerings and such for these spirits. They also met the religious needs. This is what I was saying earlier of the slaves and the freedmen, because they couldn't participate in the civic cult. So with this, you have this having an impact on Christianity, because this became so popular, and we talked a little bit about this last week, but this was as a part of official Rome religion. It became so popular that they couldn't, when Christianity took over the Roman world, they couldn't put the practice down. Like, no matter what they did, they stopped worshiping Zeus, they stopped doing this, but the stacking of the stones and all that other stuff, they couldn't get rid of those practices. So rather than getting rid of those practices, they just switched them over to saints, and used it as saints over the road, and the saints over this, and the saints over that. And that's where we get the beginning of the veneration of the saints. And that's pretty well, I mean, you can see in different places in history, it's not that's been seen by, basically it's not much to be contested. That's how it affected it. Both the Latin West and the Greek had an issue with overcoming all of those, the worship of the spirits, and so that's why they began to include them. So this is a lararium. So this is one at one house. You see the serpents, and there's almost always something where the serpent's heads are that looks like an egg, or something that has eggs on it. And then you see the altar with, this is the family genius. These are the two lares, and then they would have other things around it decorating it. You see here, there's actually a place for the offerings. They sometimes have a statue of the Lare on top of the picture, or of the genius, and then, or if there's a specific family god. But you see here, this is the genius, those are the Lares, and then behind it you see the serpent that's there. And then here's two more. Once again, the two Lares, the genius of the family, the serpent. Here's a little thing, there's little eggs on top of it. This one doesn't have as much detail. You can't see the Lares because they're on the side ones, and then that's the genius of the family. But you still see the serpent down below on the wall with the pedestal with the egg. And so you can see this is a very common motif that you find all throughout the homes in the Greco-Roman world, especially the Roman world here. So that's kind of the family popular worship. You then have the civic cults. Now cults here, don't think occult and Satan worship. The cults just means religion. So the civic religions of that time. And when we say there's no separation of sacred and secular, there's none. Like these positions are political positions. Religious ceremonies were interwoven with all the civic events. Public funds paid for the temples and the priests and everything else like that. And the people who worked for the city as city officials actually received some money and expenditures from the religion and vice versa. And the city is the one, and the government is the one who made up the sacred laws to govern the cult practices for the city. So they were one and the same. There was no separation between those. This is part of why when you look at Jerusalem during the time of Christ and prior to Christ, where it was a temple state, where the high priest is the one who is the ruler of the temple, and then you have the Sanhedrin, which is both governing the people and all of the religious practices. That was totally normal. There was no oddity about that whatsoever, and it actually was a big mark of Greco-Roman culture. So each city typically would have a patron deity that protected it. When the empire began to have more and more influence and unify more and more people, they lost a lot of their national identity, and people tended to pour their identity then into these patron deities instead. So these deities had a great deal of civic pride. One of the biggest examples of that we see in Scripture is in Acts 19:23-41. I'll forward to the next slide real quick. This is Artemis of the Ephesians. And in that story in Acts, Paul and his ministry are having such a huge impact on Ephesus that people are starting to throw away their Artemis idols, and there's such a big impact that the people who are making these idols for Artemis are losing money. They start to lose sales because no one's buying them anymore. Now, one, they're heinous to begin with. When you look at this, we have no idea really for sure what those are. Some say they're eggs, some say they're other things, and some say that they're representations of the meteorite that fell that was attributed somewhat to her and the establishment of her cult. If you look in Acts, when there's the big riot and the guy comes in and he's calming everybody down, he's like, look, we don't have to have a riot. We all know Artemis is powerful. We all know that she was there when the stone fell from the sky. That's what they're talking about, that maybe that is what she has around her garment and such. She's not a fertility goddess. She is connected somewhat with the blessing of life, period, but she's not seen as a fertility goddess. And she's just supposed to be the patron goddess of Ephesus that they're very proud of, and they give her different powers. Like I said, they thought she had power over fate eventually, so she had the necklace and such. The temple to Artemis in Ephesus was one of the great wonders of the ancient world, one of the 7 wonders. So it was beautiful. They were very proud of it. So the civic cult in Ephesus was actually a very important part to the city, and Paul's ministry started to tear that apart. But you see in that chapter in Acts, you're wondering, how is this whole city getting so upset just because the sales of these statues and so on and so forth? But when you realize how much pride there was in that goddess, and if she lost in her power and lost in her influence, Ephesus became less important in the world to them. And so it was not a small thing. You look at how much we don't want to lose our influence in the world as Americans, same thing. And then some of these deities became pan-Hellenic, which means like Apollo and Artemis both were gods that were worshipped mainly in just certain cities, that then everyone started worshiping them more broadly, and so they begin to be included in more of that Olympic gods pantheon. Yes?
Is Diana and Artemis the same? Different?
So they often are associated with each other, Diana being the Roman thing.
Oh.
They originally were developed separately in 2 different areas, but had a lot of crossover. And so, like I said, the Greeks and the Romans, when they came into contact, They just said, oh, your God is this God and ours, and yours is
Oh,
this and
like a lot
ours.
of others. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So in that sense, yes, they're the same one, but they really did kind of develop separately. So citizens and sojourners who paid respect to these deities were considered pious. So if you're living in a city like Ephesus, and somebody walks through the gate at Ephesus, and they go up and they give honor to at the altar to do what they need to for the city, and then they do incense that's to Artemis, and they offer that as they come in. They're a pious person. You're welcome in the city. If you come into the city and you ignore all of that, you're seen as an outsider, and it's not very positive. Thus, Jews and Christians would be seen as impious and disliked right from the very beginning. The Romans associated all of their success in the fact that they were pious towards these gods. So the Romans, when they would conquer, as we've said before, they would get to a city and they would go in and they were extra sure to do all that was necessary to make the god of that city happy. And they've said, in their minds, we're successful and so broadly powerful because all the gods appreciate that we're so pious and honoring them wherever we go. The images of the emperor eventually get included. So like there would be a sacred precinct within the city honoring this civic deity, and then other gods that were thought worthy would have places that would be included in that sacred precinct because they were favorable towards that goddess. So like Artemis would have a precinct to her, but there would be other gods like Apollo or somebody who could also have a representation there. And this is where you first start to see representations of the emperor and in the very beginnings of worshiping the emperor, because he gets included into these precincts with statues of him. And then when they would do this, like honor the emperor that way, and the emperor would come and see his statue there, then that city gained a lot of favor from the emperor. So there was a lot of economic benefit for having done this. And that's this is why when we went through the history of the Jews in the first half of this class, when they're like, you can't bring your shields in here, you can't bring any of these images in here, you can't do anything, you can't bring anything into our temple at all. That was weird. That was totally weird to the Roman and the Greeks that they would be that way, and that's part of what resulted in them being so disliked. So, Caesar Augustus also brought out more religious reforms. So he regulated a lot of the worship and tried to restore order to the empire. And he saw that religion was a major part that unified the empire, and he wanted to restore that because it had kind of fallen into disrepair in a sense. There are some of the old cults that he brought back. If there were vacant priesthoods, he brought those in, and he rebuilt 82 temples, and then instated the new cults like the one we talked about with the Lares Capitales. So he saw religious reform as one and the same as the political and the civic reform, and it all got brought up to a new level when he was emperor. Now, in these civic cults, the priesthood was different than what we think of as a priesthood. The definition of one person from back in that time, Machines, the orator, he's just the person who receives the perquisites and whose occupation is to pray to heaven for you. So the perquisites is just what it sounds like, the perks. They received the food and so on and so forth that we're going to talk about. Plato said there is also the priestly class who, as the law declares, know how to give the gods gifts from men in the form of sacrifices, which are acceptable to them, and to ask on our behalf blessings in return from them. So it's the know-how. That's the key thing they picked there. The priest was the person who had the know-how because they correctly knew how to do the sacrifice so that the god would respond in the correct way. And this is where you begin to see that this priesthood and the worship of the gods, and then this idea of magic, and here's this formula and everything you do to get, they weren't very far away from each other. The priesthood wasn't centralized. In other words, there wasn't like one like high priest over all the different gods and things like that. Each temple had their own rules and everything else like that. It was seldom full time. In other words, the only priesthoods that tended to be like full time, like you were the priest all the time, was there are some gods where you would inherit it because of your family background, that you were the one that was the priest, and that would be full time. But still, that wasn't full time like full time job either. Almost none of the priests functioned as a full time job. They often had other things that they did. Only in the larger civic cults that required more to do was it a full time job, but then you typically served only a year. Anyone could perform priestly duties theoretically, and so some cults, though some cults had restrictions. So what were those restrictions? Some typical ones: you had to know how to do the ceremonies. You typically had to be a citizen because of your citizenship, and it was a civic god. You often had to I'm not seeing it here. You typically had to be male, although some did allow for females. Many cults required the person performing priestly duties to be free from physical defect. So that's something that you see in Scripture, but is also common in almost all religious practices. And celibacy was often required for the term of service, so not your whole life, but during the term of service, you would be celibate. So the different ways you could obtain that priesthood: inheritance, which was not the most common, but I already talked about that one. You could be elected to it, and this was actually common, especially within Rome, because the priesthood positions that you would have was part of what they call the cursus honorum, which is the process by which you got politically more, and you climbed the political ladder. So these priest positions within different civic cults were very typical political positions you had to hit on your way up that political ladder. But you could also purchase the right to be the priest. And when you find and hear some of the perks, you'll understand why some people purchased those rights. So the duties is basically appointed to one deity in one sanctuary. So you weren't like a priest at different areas within the same city. It's like, here's your one God that you are worshiping. This is one you honor. This is one you have to know how to do all the stuff, and that's it. You had to do the care of the temple and the image, literally cleaning and such like that. Take care of the shrine's contents. So as gifts were brought in, you had to keep record of those things, store them, and make sure that they weren't missing. And then you had the financial administration of the temple. So like when monies came in to a temple, that actually was handled by the government. It wasn't handled by the priests themselves. The ritual duties, you had to correctly perform all of the ceremonies, and you had to do them at the correct times. You had to know how to do that. But you also would preside over festivals for the deity, and a lot of these deities would have an annual festival that would celebrate them. And then basically when somebody came to do a sacrifice, whether to fulfill a vow or to make a vow or such like that, you were the one that made sure that they did it correctly. So some of the benefits, those perks, you would get a portion of any sacrifice that came through. So yes, that meant you had plenty of food to eat, but you often had more food than you actually could eat, and you often would sell that actually, and even make money off of that. Depending on how much responsibility there was and the size of the temple, you could actually receive a salary and be paid for doing what you were doing, or have goods in exchange for the work that you were doing. While you were serving as a priest, you were exempt from all taxes, and you were exempt from all public duties, so you couldn't be called up to war and things like that. You would have places of honor whenever you went to religious festivals, and you go to public venues. You always were honored and given important places to sit. And you would wear a garland, wreath, or gold crown. So there's always something to indicate you were special. which is partly why people would pay money for these things to be noticed. Because I mean, if you're, even as a politician, you're trying to be more well-known, you're trying to have other people be aware of who you are, and so it was a really good way to do that. So, civic cults excluded non-citizens, women, and slaves, though you could still honor a god, but somebody else had to do the sacrifice for you. And non-civic cults, you typically lacked these exclusions, and that's why they became so popular amongst the people. So we do have some examples of ritual requirements that had to do with purity and can appear like morals. These are rare, but we still have them. So typically the purity is not a matter of morality, and this one is going to show you, this is the instructions for the temple of Athena at Pergamum. So you read, it says, whoever wishes to visit the temple of the goddess, whether a resident of the city or anyone else, they must refrain from intercourse with his wife or husband that day, and from intercourse with another other than his wife or husband for the preceding 2 days, and must complete the required lustrations. The same prohibition applies to contact with the dead and with the delivery of woman in childbirth. So you'll notice that, some of that, the contact with the dead, delivery with a woman in childbirth, was similar to what you would see in Jewish sacrificial system. However, there wasn't this idea of, if you had intimacies with another person other than your wife, then just come in, you just gotta wait 2 days now. But that shows you the idea that the morals are very different at this time. Also, some rules were introduced under the influence of philosophy. They were the exception, though, not the rule. So we have a household cult in Philadelphia. And this is not U.S., by the way. But the rules prohibited entrance of robbers, murderers, users of drugs, which users of drugs at this time would be like sorcerers. They would have things they'd put together and give to people, and that would be, we think of them more as sorcery. The Greek word for sorcerer is pharmakia, which we get pharmacy from. Adulterers and those who induce abortion. Now, the thing about adulterers here, that would be somebody who you have that legitimate marriage, and then a man sleeps with a legitimate wife of another man, thus making the whole inheritance line screwed up. That was almost the greater offense of adultery at this time, as we're going to see much later in this class. But the greater offense is how you're screwing up the inheritance line and messing with that, not the idea of are you being faithful to one other person in deep monogamous love. And so you see that these were, and if they had induced an abortion, they couldn't come. And these were presented in the context as commands from Zeus to the owner of the house. So Zeus was the one who said it. And that's very rare that you see a god commanding something like that. Even when there were restrictions like this, typically it was just chosen and set by the civic magistrates in the city. Sometimes clothing was regulated. So women's hair was to be loose, or the man's head was to be covered or uncovered. So some required the man's head to be covered, some required him to have his head uncovered. So the sacrifices, there are 3 reasons that you typically would do a sacrifice. These are pretty common sense. Honor the god with the sacrifice. You want to avert evil and receive some benefit, or you want to give recognition of benefits already received. Boring myself again. Most sacrifices were yearly or monthly. Now, so each god would have like an annual festival, and so they would have a particular sacrifice that had to be done annually. It doesn't mean you'd only sacrifice once a year, period. It was just whichever god you were doing, they would have an annual sacrifice that was there. With the household cults, the worshiping your household lares and such, that would have been typically a monthly sacrifice that you would have to do for that, other than the daily oblations to them that you're setting up. When you have these sacrifices, they'd be both animals and vegetables, and you have this even in scripture. A lot of the sacrifices would be grain and the mint and the tithe, or the mint and the thyme, the cumin and all that stuff. So there's mint and dill. That's what mint and dill and cumin. So you gave offerings from everything, not just animals. It was generally believed that the more abundant the offering, the more blessing you would get from the gods, which gives the rich people the obvious advantage at that point. So that's why some of the philosophers try to change the public perception. It's like, and this is similar to what Jesus does with the widow and the widow's mite. When he's like, who really gave more? This guy who gave all this money, but he has a ton of money, or this widow who gave a little widow's mite, but that's all she had left. And so that was also being brought out by the philosophers as well. So a portion of the sacrifice would go to the god. A portion of the sacrifice would go to the priest or the neochorus. So the neochorus, if it was a large enough temple and you had to have a manager working under you, that's the neochorus. And so both the priest and the neochorus would receive a portion at that point. And then a portion was taken home to be eaten. And the priest had the right to sell the temple's portion in the market. And when you understand how all of this works, 1 Corinthians 8 through 10 really kind of starts to make more sense as you go through. In 1 Corinthians 8, 10, 9, 13, and 10, 20, this is talking about the Christian going into the actual celebration where the temple, being present in the temple where the ceremony is actually being performed and participating at that point. Whereas 1 Corinthians 10, 25 to 26 deals with when a priestly portion is being sold in the meat market. So when Paul says, when you go to the meat market, buy the meat and don't raise questions of conscience, because the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So in other words, it's no longer in the temple context. It's not part of the actual ceremony. However, it was once offered to a god, but now they're just selling it. And he's like, just buy it, because the earth is the Lord's. That doesn't matter. Get the meat. Get the cheap one. And that was typically preferred because it was a cheaper cut, but a good, cheaper cost, better cut. In 1 Corinthians 10:27, when it says, you go to somebody's house, he says, eat without raising any questions. But if they say to you, this has been offered to as a sacrifice, then don't eat for the sake of conscience, he says. And what's being said there is that, that person could have gone to the temple, offered everything else, and then they brought it home and they have the meat there. And that was the concern. Like, now they have their portion that they brought home from the temple that they're just eating at home. And you get invited over to their house for dinner. And what do you do? That was offered to a god. And he basically says, just if you go and they say nothing and you don't know, eat. If that's what you want to eat, it's no big deal. But if they say something, then there's this sense of, okay, they're saying this to kind of test you and to see whether or not you are actually willing to participate, because they see this participating in that exercise with the other god. And so he's like, don't eat then at that point, because now they're kind of testing you on it. And he says, for the sake of conscience, he says, the other man's not yours. In other words, your concern is that this other person is going to read that situation differently and think that Christians can participate in idol sacrifices. And so for their conscience, for what they're thinking, you're abstaining, not because it's wrong for you to eat it. And so if you understand some more how all this works, then some of that makes sense. Here are some reliefs that show some of the sacrificial practices. The large disc that they're holding would have been a gift that was being given to the temple. Here you see them holding the large oxen, and the guy's getting ready to utilize his axe to dispatch of the oxen. A large animal like this would not have been killed on the altar or placed on the altar. In fact, the altars you're going to see in just a little bit are too small to hold anything close to that size. Most of them are going to be about yay big to yay big and about this high. You're not going to put a giant oxen on there. So what they would do is they would kill the oxen elsewhere, and then they would go and pour out a portion of the blood and some stuff onto the altar, or burn a portion of it on the altar. They wouldn't put the whole thing there. Even within the biblical Jewish exercise, only on a burnt offering did you put the entire animal on there. There almost was always either just a portion or what they called a wave offering, where they took the portion that was for the temple and for the Lord, and they just waved it over the altar, and then they went away, and they still ate of it. Here you can see the smaller altar. On here you'll notice there's fruit, there's other kind of offerings. They're bringing gifts and stuff, but you still have the oxen in the background that's going to be given as well as a sacrifice. But you can tell you're not going to offer this oxen on that altar. And again, here you see another example of that smaller altar, and then here are some pictures of actual altars that they found. So you can see they're not huge, and so with the, let me see if I got, which one was it? Maybe I didn't get the one that yeah. There was a picture I was going to show you because it had an oxen carved into it, but it had this like crown on it. And what they would often do is they would actually put gold and stuff on the animal that was being offered. And so it was like a combination of the financial and that. And you'll see that's when Alexander the Great gives offerings to the temple in Jerusalem, and when Pompey gives offering to cleanse the temple in Jerusalem, he does that. They would actually take the horns and pour molten gold over them, so the horns would be gold and stuff like that. It'd add to the value of the sacrifice. So, when doing these sacrifices, typically a lot of them are votive offerings, which is, if this, then this. Lord, if you get me out of this foxhole and alive, I'll serve you forever. It's like kind of that foxhole thing. If I'm healed, I'll offer this when I'm healed. If I'm successful at this venture, I'll offer this. If I arrive safely at my destination, I'll offer such and such. And so they would then, having made that promise, when that thing happened, they now are obligated. We talked last week about being under the vow. They were obligated to go and do that offering. So they would arrive, share with the priest the vow that they made. The priest would give them the correct ceremony to follow, and then they would offer that up. These were considered obligatory. If you didn't, if you received blessing and you didn't do that, then you were in trouble and you were going to get a lot less blessing or cursed. The thanks, in other words, it was a response. They didn't do this prayer ahead of time. They just received something and they went and responded with that. These offerings showed their constant dependence on the god and constant awareness that the gods were somehow impacting them. Some of the offerings weren't always animals or sacrifices of that effect. It could just be money and gold and such. And then there was a sense of the people tithing and still giving their first fruits. So that's why when we read the New Testament in the Greek, we have a word for first fruits and tithing that's there, because there was a sense of honoring the God with a regular certain amount as well. That was usually given at that monthly time or the annual sacrifice, that there would be a portion given to them. So ritual prescriptions. There is also prayers and hymns. They're closely associated with the festivals. There's not a lot to say about the prayers and hymns other than that they were regularly sung. They'd be sung by groups. They would be sung by choirs. They'd be sung by individuals. And certain things had to be accompanied with certain songs. And so there was actually music involved in the worship at that time. But the big thing you had were these festivals, especially the civic cults having the festivals where it was now time to celebrate that civic god. It was their time of the year. And you'd have the annual sacrifice, and then you'd also have big public banquets, entertainment, processions. It's just basically parades and such. It was a huge deal, and this is kind of what leads to our concept of a festival today, and the fairs that we have, where it's a mix of all these different things. And these Panegyris, gathering of all, They would be celebrations to the gods that were recognized all around the Greek world. And they would be celebrations combining religion, art, trade, athletics, and amusement. Anyone want to guess what the most well-known of these is?
Of amusement, the gladiators.
Most well-known of a big gathering of all, where art, trade, athletics, and amusement are all combined
Chariot
together.
races.
What's that?
Chariot races?
No, it's. Trust me. As soon as I say it, you're gonna go,
Olympics?
oh, Olympics.
Oh, sure.
So this is how the Olympics started. They were a celebration of the gods, and they would come and they had all of these art, trade, but the athletics became the most popular portion of them. And then you started to have the games, and the games are held like every 4 years. Now these tended to be 2, 3, or 4 year periods. They weren't always annual, and 4 years was pretty common. You have because there's the Olympic Games, and then there was the Achaean Games, I think, and there's a number of like ones that were Sparta, ones with Athens, and things like that. And they were always, in this interesting thing, these were part of the worship of the deities. And so a lot of the athletic events would be paired together with that. You can see how religion mixes with all of these things. And usually in Valley celebrations, there would be a big procession, which we get our word pomp from, and it was one of the central features. And this hasn't impacted us at all. But this is one of the celebrations of Easter that is being done like one of these festivals. They often combine a whole bunch of things, but they also you'll go to certain places, and the town has a patron saint, and then every year they celebrate that patron saint on its particular day, and they have parades and all that stuff. That's straight from the Greco-Roman culture of that time. That's just continued down through the days. And of course, we have nothing like this where we live. Oh wait, is that getting too close to home? Anyways, so with these kind of religious practices that they had, now we reach the one part of the civic cults that really was a bane for the beginning of Christianity, and what our brothers and sisters had to face, and that's the ruler cult. The book of Revelation, when you go through those 7 churches that are there in the book of Revelation, this is what they were facing the most of, and a lot of the stuff is being pointed at this ruler cult. So, general understanding. The line between divine and human in these cultures that we already talked about was not so clear. There's a lot of study that's gone in to look back at like how did they come to the original gods, and there are some that say that there seems to be evidence that they always thought that even the original gods were once the very powerful ancestors that then started to be venerated as powerful ancestors who then were thought of as gods. And so there already was that kind of blending, plus their gods were very human-like in behavior and appearance and everything. And so in that way, it blended that line between human and deity pretty well. And when the ruler here is being seen as divine, it's different than what you and I would think of. We see there being just a natural difference between the essence of a human and a god, whereas for them, there wasn't that natural difference of essence, but it also was not, it's kind of hard to explain, it's not him being worshipped as, he was born a god and has been a god and so on and so forth, but rather the power that he holds and has is up there with the gods. I mean, you think that these emperors could say to a person, put him to death, and he had to die. I mean, the authority that he had, the power he had, that he could go to cities and nationalities and say, you're going to do this, and they would do what he said. That power that he held was close to that of the gods, and was thought you could only have that power if the gods had accepted you as that high level and granted you that power. And so therefore, it's like they, for some reason, saw that you were worthy of that. Now, part of that worthiness is not necessarily goodness in the worthiness. A lot of it has to do with the strength of their heroic character. And when I say heroic, I mean their ability to do great and mighty things and to become very powerful. Not heroic like we think of heroes as being selfless and everything today. It's like, no, they went out and they conquered and they were able to pull off feats that other people couldn't. And that ability goes back to that Roman idea of their genius, of their family. In other words, that spirit that was in their family that empowered them was so powerful and strong that this ultimate representation of that family had achieved all of this power. And so you're already worshiping the genius of the family, and then now how hard is it to worship the representation of that genius? Now, in the eastern side, and I'm sorry if I get ahead and I'll have to skip things later, but on the eastern side of the empire, Turkey and Syria and such like that, they went more quickly to just worshiping the man. On the western side, in Italy and such, they always, for much longer, saw it as we're just worshiping the genius of his family. We're not actually worshiping the man. And so that was actually a division within the empire, not exactly east and west, because there were people in the West that did, see him as actually God, and there are people in the East that questioned it if they were more traditional Romans. Because of this, living rulers were not seen in the same light as the gods. Typically, it was the dead ruler that now was exalted to that point. And so what you are going to see, or what we did see in the history, is that, for instance, when Julius Caesar dies, Caesar Augustus has him proclaimed a deity. And that's how Caesar Augustus refers to himself as the son of God. Because he's the adopted son of Julius Caesar, and Caesar was proclaimed a god. Now, when Caesar Augustus dies, Tiberius has him declared a god. And then when Tiberius dies, Claudius Gaius, has him declared it, and they would do that, to bring their own adoption into that family as part of that divineness coming off onto them. Now, in that adoption, the Roman adoption is so strong that you are considered to be part of that family's genius if you've been adopted into it. And so that's why, even though these, from Caesar down through until you get to, basically until you get to Nero, all of them have these adopted into what is called the Julio-Claudian line. And those two names, Julio-Claudian, had these geniuses to the family that were considered to be very powerful, and that's what factored into a lot of the worship. When this is happening, like we said, one of the primary ways it starts to occur is they're putting up representations of the emperor in these sacred precincts of these civic deities in the cities to honor ruler. Now, Caesar Augustus, he actually, when they started to say they're going to do this, he insisted that it was to Rome and Augustus, so that it was always seen that as a worship of the power of Rome, of which he represented. That's how he had originally put that out when he okayed that practice. Now, how did this even start? Like, why even go this direction? Well, first there's Eastern influence. Egypt. In Egypt, Pharaoh was always a god. I mean, we know that from Scripture. And then the Syria and Babylonian and Persian empires, they didn't really see their kings as gods per se, but they addressed them that way. It was like an extra honorific, terms that they would use. Like Daniel saying, Nebuchadnezzar, may you live forever. Like, he's not going to live forever, but it's just a way that you would address them. But you don't really see them being worshipped, but you see a practice of honoring them with names like that. Now, where that becomes an issue is when you get then to Alexander the Great, as we're going to look at. because then when they are honoring him that way, he's taking it more seriously than they're meeting it, is kind of what's going to happen. The Greek influences, the gods were seen as supreme form of human excellence, and so in that sense, seeing them as just a higher level of human existence aids for this, okay, well then you can blend into that as a human if you're heroic enough. So the idea that the great deeds of men could become gods, which is where we get the hero worship within the Greek things. So here is Achilles, or here is Hercules, and it's a man, but he does so many great feats that he becomes a god and he gets worshipped. That also lended an ease amongst the Greek culture. So the Romans, it was this worship of the genius that made it easier. For the Greeks, it was this idea of the worshiping of the heroes that made it easier. And the issue here was, in essence, the power of their virtue. So in the Greek word arete, Latin word virtus, we think of virtue typically as, if somebody's very virtuous, what do you guys think that means? If I say so-and-so is very virtuous, what do you start picturing?
Righteous.
Okay. Righteous.
Holy.
Holy.
Moral.
Moral.
Yeah.
None of that's in the original word. So the original word, arites, and the Latin virtus. So virtus in Latin, the word for man is work, V-I-R. And this is basically strong, masculine. That's the idea, is that strength that's there. Arete has that, but it's also has a certain sense of being a powerful citizen. Like there's an idea of good citizen or whatever. Behind both of these words is nothing to do with morals, but rather the person who doesn't just sit and do nothing, but goes out and accomplishes great things because of the strength of their personality. They go out and they can do amazing things. That's arites and virtus, which is, when you get to 2 Peter 1:5, it says, be sure to add to your faith virtue, arites. So it's not talking about add to your faith, all this holiness, righteousness, goodness, and so on. That comes after this word. But the idea of adding to your faith virtue is that add to, yes, you believe, but go after this. You need to add to your faith that zeal of becoming all you can be, and that's what's actually being referred to in that passage. Not add to your faith this, really holy looking, character. Now, as you go, add to your faith virtue, and then after virtue, it's faith, virtue, and to your virtue. Your faith virtue, to your virtue knowledge, and to your knowledge self-control, and your self-control godliness, and to your godliness brotherly kindness, mercy. Now you add to your by doing that, you're adding, when you add your faith to virtue, in other words, like you're pursuing this. So when you're pursuing this, what are you doing? You're pursuing the knowledge. When you pursue the knowledge, then you understand what you're supposed to be doing, and you have to exercise self-control to do that. Once you've exercised that self-control, it becomes a part of you, and so now you're godly. And once you're godly, then you're starting to realize who God is, and you add to that there's this brotherly kindness, and then out of that comes that genuine love of God. So you see that process of that all being added. But at the end, the brotherly kindness and love, that's typically what we're thinking of at the word virtue already. But it actually, that's later, that's the brotherly kindness and love. Virtue is that go and pursue it. This strength of virtue that is being brought out, if a human being, in other words, had so much zeal, so much strength of character and personality and everything to go out and achieve all these amazing things, that strength inside of them, that would be like the genius of their family, was seen at what exalted them up to a divine. Where it's not divine like they've been there from the beginning of creation, and no, it's divine as in you are now worthy of this honor. And if we pray in your name, some of that strength can come our way and help us.
Is that the kind of the basis for the saints then? People?
To some extent, it does go. That does with the saints. It tends not to be the there is some of that. It's like they were so godly that they now can get more sway with God than we can. And then the martyrs, especially the martyrs, begin to be seen as that strength of virtue and willingness to die for these things, and that kind of exalts you above where the average person is. And so then the other thing is the traditional civic basis of religion, where you had that ability for things to be brought into that civic sacred space and be honored, even though they were just personal or impersonal forces and whatever. So it was really a lot easier for the ruler cult to make its way into the culture back in that time. So it developed first with Alexander the Great. So he conquers Persia. As he's coming through, he gets to Egypt and he's victorious in Egypt. But when he's victorious in Egypt, they actually receive him and welcome him. He didn't really fight much in Egypt. And when he's victorious there, they honor him, calling him not just king and pharaoh, but the son of, I don't know if it was Ra or one of the other ones. No, son of Ammon. Because Ammon Ra. So son of Ammon. He then is really insistent that he goes and sees the oracle of Ammon that's out in the desert there in Egypt. And he goes out there. When he gets there, the priest greets him with, the son of Ammon, son of God, which was the normal way you would greet the pharaoh all the time, and it was just a traditional way that kind of went to Alexander's head, and he starts to see himself more as such. Then he founds the city of Alexandria in Egypt, and it was common within Greece that the founder of the city was seen like a hero and honored and worshipped because you're the founder of the city. And then he founds all these Alexandrias, and then he finally conquers Persia, and they start giving him all of these praises like they normally would to their kings, and this is all going to his head. And he begins to accept this idea that he's actually deity, and he dies, and then finds out clearly he's not. But that was kind of the beginning of it. After him, the Ptolemaic and Seleucid dynasties. The Ptolemaic dynasty was in Egypt already, so they already had some of that again because of the pharaoh and such. The Seleucid dynasty starts to see things this way. This is why Antiochus Epiphanes, that word Epiphanes, is putting him right on the edge of deity, similar to what Caesar's Augustus is. Augustus is saying, you're more than just a man. And Epiphanes is kind of saying the same thing. And they would address in their letters, king and God. And so the Seleucids and the Hellenistic kings really, went that way. The Roman emperors then, by the time you get Caesar and Caesar Augustus, this was not an unusual thing. And so the fact that they are then put out as gods is not overly shocking. Augustus is kind of the first one to do that by exalting Julius Caesar to a divinity. Him taking the name Augustus shows he's willing to go that direction, but as I said earlier, the emperors then just do the favor to the last guy and make all of them divine. Only Nero, Gaius Caligula, and Domitian, while they were alive, pushed to be worshipped, honestly worshipped as a god. The rest of them, it was just kind of an honoring of them, the power of Rome, and they didn't really push it. But those three actually pushed to be worshipped as gods. So the forms that this took, so the virtues or the genius of the emperor was worshipped before he was ever worshipped personally. Talked about that. It was practiced by the provinces. In other words, outside of official Roman territory and outside of Greece itself. So Turkey, Syria, Hispania, Northern Africa, that's where this was more common, but especially common in the eastern provinces of Egypt, Syria, and what is modern day Turkey. And its center was Asia, and the very center of that was Ephesus. And so Ephesus and the 7 cities that you have in the book of Revelation, they were all caught up in this ruler cult at this time. Now, if Revelation is written at the time of Domitian, then you actually have Domitian who was claiming to be divinity, or it's written at the time of Nero, and he's one of the other ones that was claiming to be divinity. This practice, there were cities, groups of cities that would do it, but professional corporations adopted it. And so this is becoming one of the major issues you're dealing with in Revelation, is that there would be trade guilds. And so a trade guild for all the masons, or a trade guild for all the carpenters, a trade guild for all the metal workers. Those trade guilds were a huge economic power within the Roman world. And in fact, it's a leader of one of those trade guilds that gets everything going at Ephesus about Artemis. And there's another leader of a trade guild that causes problems for Paul because he tries to shut things down. And so these trade guilds would have the deities they would worship, and many of them did the emperor cult. And so they were a major way that Christians, if you didn't then worship the emperor and honor him that way, it shut down your ability to sell and function in your profession. The military corps did it. You'll remember when we went over the military that they would burn incense to their standards and everything. Well, they also would have ways that they would do that to the emperor, and they were actually really zealous about it, because obviously for them that was a major part of their power. And then the colleges of freedmen, so groups of freedmen that had come together in social gatherings and such, they would have a patron deity, and that was often Caesar that was being honored. The temples were slow in coming in Rome, but were present in Asia and East as early as Tiberius. So an actual temple, so prior to Tiberius, the emperor worship is happening in the sacred precincts of the other gods, of the civic deity. At the time of Tiberius, you are actually starting to see a temple built to Caesar, and he's being honored there, where it's just to them. Now that during Tiberius, it would not have been a temple to Tiberius; it would have been a temple built to Caesar Augustus. But it's an actual temple being built. In the West, in Rome, that happened very, very late, if at all, and so it didn't pick up as much in the West. The temples that were built, they were usually built in the provincial capitals. One, that's where all the Romans are coming to put their soldiers. It's where, if Caesar came to a province, he'd be in the capital, he would see it, and so on and so forth. This is partly why, Nero gets so mad, because all these other places are putting his image up in all these temple precincts and building temples to Caesar. And then the Jews are like, nope, can't do that. We're not going to let you. And that's begins to lead. So as the imperial cult increases, the tension with Judaism increases, and the favor with Rome gets lost. It also included associating the emperor with one of the area's gods, usually by placing an image of the emperor in that temple precinct, which we talked about. Augustus structured the cultic practice for the emperor cult, or the ruler cult, specifically to involve the equestrians, the freedmen, the slaves, and such, to bridge that gap and to have it be a more popular religion. And then in Rome, the imperial cult was seen more as an expression of belief in the unity of the empire than it was necessarily seen as worshiping Caesar. That part of it, it's just a belief in the unity of the empire. It's just patriotism. So to give you guys an idea, you look at how much we all got up in arms, or people got up in arms, when we had somebody who wouldn't stand and pledge allegiance to the flag or salute during the national anthem, but instead knelt. Caused a bit of a ruckus, didn't it? Well, part of the struggle with that is that's what the Christians were doing at that time. Here was this expression of patriotism, gratitude to the nation that had given them the Pax Romana, the freedom and the peace that they had. Here was the thing everybody knows was responsible, and it was the way that they honored and showed that patriotism, and all the people that died to give them that freedom and that peace, and you're going to dishonor them by not doing these little sacrifices. And how could you? Like, everybody does these sacrifices. That's where the Christians were at. and they had to choose. I mean, and what you're finding is in the book of Revelation, when you have this, you hate the teachings of the Nicolaitans, which are the teachings of Balaam, and you have this woman Jezebel. Now, what you see with with Jezebel and Balaam, the thing they both have in common is they both were agents, and notice it's the teaching of Balaam, because Balaam told the king of Moab, you cannot get God to curse his people unless you get them to fall into idolatry. So the Moabites go in and intentionally draw the Israelites into idolatry. Jezebel, what does she know? She's the one that pushed Baal worship on Israel and brought them into idolatry. And what this group, the Nicolaitans, were, my understanding of it is debated, because it's not real easy to just take a word and tear it apart and there it is easy. But you do have a word there that is very common throughout. So every time you go through the churches, it'll say, to him who is overcome, I will give, to him who overcomes, or to him who is victorious, I will give. That word is Nikos, which we get Nike from. Laos is the word for people, or crowd, or group of people. And so Nikolaos, or Nicolaitans, would be the victorious people. And what seems to be the case is, you have already in 2 Peter 3, Peter refers to those who are taking Paul's teachings and twisting them to say what they want, and then leading to destruction. And what I believe was happening was they were taking Paul's teachings on these meat and stuff offered sacrifice to idols. They were saying, look, we know that Caesar is not God. We know these things aren't the case. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. What does it hurt to just go along with this? Do the honoring, and there's ways they say, yes, that's how the Greeks see it, but the Romans, they just see it as, honoring the genius of the family. It's just a patriotic duty. Just do this. And they would have said, and the teaching of this woman Jezebel, she would have been saying, you can do this. And so these people were saying, I can be a good Christian, and I can still honor the emperor, and then I don't have to worry about losing my job and losing all the pay. And that's what they were doing. And so with one of the biggest struggles, from my understanding, in those 7 churches, is this temptation to join this civic ruler cult that had gotten such popularity in that area. That area, Ephesus and those 7 cities, was part of a kingdom where the king willed his kingdom to Rome. So if you remember that when we went through the history, it was the kingdom was the kingdom of Lydia. When the king died, they were so pro-Roman that they just willed the whole kingdom, and everybody went with it. Everybody just joined Rome. They loved Rome, and they had the Pax Romana, this peace like they hadn't had in years, because they were the main battleground between Greece and Persia, and then they were the main battleground between Antiochus and the Seleucids and the others in the area. So they had this peace like they hadn't had, and all that appreciation. So it was very easy for that imperial cult to become so popular, and that's a lot of what they're struggling with. So that's a lot of where this ruler cult has an influence on how we understand the New Testament. So that's it. Any questions you guys have? Yes.
Back when you were talking about like the worshiping the nature spirits and stacking the stones, and I was just curious, is that one of those things when you see that being done by people, they are unwittingly sort of worshiping the spirits, sort of like the Ouija board and the...
Yeah, it is. It's an unconscious thing, and I don't, with that, you could go, well, they didn't really mean it in their heart, things like that, sure. But I know for me, knowing that I don't stack stones, I do tend to knock them over. It's just got kind of a, but it's, and it's, I do see Christians that do it, and I don't sit there and judge them, and I don't this or that, and it's not unless we get in a discussion that I bring it up, because they're gonna, if they don't have time for this whole conversation, they're like you're super strict weirdo, kind of thing. And it's not the end of the world, and they'll stand before God and not me. So I'm not overly worried about it, but I do not do it. I know, and won't do it. And there's a lot of things though that we have that flow from these things that you'd see in Western culture. I joke, I put the thing up with the St. Patrick's Day and all the different festivals and stuff like that. But there's a lot of stuff you don't see that in the Old Testament. You don't see that being brought out in Scripture as a thing to do, and yet we take that form and we use it for many things. There are ways that I'll say it's come dangerously close to worshiping liberty. There are ways that we see the freedom that we have and some of the things that have to do with the founding of our country that aren't exactly the same thing as what Scripture puts out when they say the word, and that we kind of hold to, that can get close to some of these things. I don't know if I remember telling you guys about the song. It's a song I actually love. I love the song. I sang it. But it's the old cathedral quartet gospel song. You guys know the cathedrals? Maybe? But it's "The cross is my statue of liberty."
Yeah.
And it's like that statue of liberty. There's certain things with that, and the flag. I mean, I'll be honest with you. When the issue came with Colin Kaepernick not saluting the flag, I understand people's sentiments, but I was shocked at the number of Christians who responded as though he was immoral to do so. And I'm not. I mean, I joined the army because I was patriotic. I understand the sentiment of American soldiers dying. I also was in the army, and I know what some of those American soldiers are like. But it's just we look at some of those things, and we hold them with a religious fervor that I don't know is completely appropriate sometimes. And I think that's where, when you know the history and all these other things with Rome, see the similarities with who we are and stuff like that. Now his reason for kneeling would be different than what I might agree with, but to approach that as though he was sinful because he didn't, that disturbed me. So I think there are ways we have to be careful because we know this history.
Jesus was thought by some who was hoping he would come as a king. Mm-hmm. Does any of this kind of influence that? Even though they were Jews, were they influenced by the cults and in what Jesus might be, which he wasn't, of course. But
where we're going to see the biggest influence coming is because the philosophers got close to the truth on some things, because of people like Caesar being referred to as Savior and God. That was one of the titles they started referring to him as. That here we have Christ and he's Savior and the Son of God. And so some will say, well, that's why the church went that way. So it's a thing in history we got to wrestle with. Like it's not why we call him the Son of God, and we mean something totally different. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're saying all things were created through him, and nothing was made that has been made except what came through him. That's different than he was a really strong person and kind of moved his way up into deity. Totally different thing. But because there's a similarity of wording, and that was already present in the culture, that led to people being able to take the truths about Christ and twist them. And we're going to see that next week with the Gnosticism, because what's going to happen is the mystery religions and some of these things are going to combine for a doctrine about Christ that's way off, and does impact early Christianity. There were a number of heresies in ways that these things mixed and blended with the Christianity at a level that made it no longer Christianity. So, and they were popular too.
So. The Jews were kind of influenced by that happening around them.
So somewhat, like the Sadducees seem to have been somewhat influenced by the concept of the fate, where they didn't adopt any of the other lower gods, but they still honored God as like that fate, but like resurrection was gone, everything else was gone, and everything went down to just do the correct ceremony, which is a very Greco-Roman way of approaching sacrifice. and it wasn't, if you'll notice, the Greco-Roman sacrifices had nothing to do with their eternal destiny. And the religion had nothing to do with their eternal destiny. Only the philosophers started to point that out. And that's why Gorgias, who Socrates argues with, Gorgias is saying, what's wrong with being a tyrant? At least he's happy. And if you're happy, isn't that the best thing? So who cares what else you do? And that's the philosophy that came up. And so the Sadducees kind of went into that thing of like, there's no real eternity, there's no anything. It's just, if you want God's favor in this life, you got to do these ceremonies right, and that's all that there is. That's very Greco-Roman. You can see that in their religious practices. You also see the concept of buying the high priesthood, which was common within Greco-Roman, but was not okay in Jewish, but it clearly came in to the Jewish side of things, that because the Greeks started to offer it for that, and the Jews just went with it. That's why you have multiple high priests at the time of Christ versus one, because he's supposed to be high priest till he dies. So yeah, you see a lot of that influence on Judaism. Within Christianity, there was definitely the biggest thing you're going to find with Christianity is how difficult it was for the people to come out of their immoral lifestyles. You're going to see that. You see that in Corinthians and stuff like that. You used to be this, you used to be this, but now you're this. But they used to be where like none of that's wrong. Like I can go have all the affairs I want. I can practice homosexuality. I can do all that stuff, and it has nothing to do with my religion at all. And now all of a sudden, no, I can't do that. So that was a very difficult thing for many of them to come out of. We're heading more that direction in our culture now, but that was difficult for the good news of the gospel to make that transformation. But that's also why when you look at like Romans 2, and Paul's making an argument, and this may be different than what you guys heard, but he's making this argument: when Gentiles do by nature, the things required of the law, then that is a I can't remember what he says, but one, he uses a key thing. They're doing it by nature. Now the reason he's bringing that up is because these are saved Gentiles. I don't think he's talking about the Gentiles who are not saved. That would be debated by some scholars, but I feel he's talking about saved Gentiles, and his argument is this: you know how immoral and wretched all the Gentiles are. So we share the gospel, and these Gentiles start to live by the law of God because it's written on their hearts. Doesn't that prove to you they should be accepted into the people of God rather than cast out and kept out of Israel? That's his argument that he's making in Romans 2 and 3 and on. And so it is amazing when you stop and realize how immoral that culture was, without any sense of morality, that these Gentiles would come to Christ and within weeks be living a moral life. That's nuts. So, yeah. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end because it's 8, and I'm not going to keep you as late as last time because I got in trouble. So, have a good week.